hushed tones from the living room pulled me from a half-sleep. It was late, past midnight, and David was usually deep asleep by then, or at least quietly reading. But tonight there was a strange intensity in his voice, a low rumble I'd never heard before. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound, and peered around the doorframe. David stood by the window, his back to me, the phone pressed tight to his ear. The moonlight cast long shadows in the room, making him look taller, somehow more formidable. He was speaking Korean, a language he rarely used around me, and certainly never with this kind of urgency. His words were clipped, precise, and laced with an authority that was completely foreign to the calm, gentle fisherman I married. "Territory," he said, the word cutting through the quiet like a knife. My breath hitched. "Family business?" He paused, listening intently, then responded with a cold, almost predatory edge. "It will be handled. No loose ends." His hand, usually so steady when mending nets or steering his boat, was clenched into a fist at his side. The man I thought I knew, the quiet, unassuming man who loved the sea, was gone. In his place was someone else entirely, a stranger, with eyes that seemed to hold a chilling, calculating depth. He hung up the phone with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silence. For a long moment, he just stood there, his shoulders rigid. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes met mine, and the usual warmth, the gentle affection I'd grown used to, was completely absent. They were flat, devoid of emotion, like dark stones. "My real family called," he stated, his voice flat, his gaze unwavering. "You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." The words landed like a physical blow. The implication was clear. My life, my choices, my future. They were no longer my own. I was no longer just his wife. I was an asset, a piece of property in some dark, dangerous game I knew nothing about. He offered no apology, no explanation, just a cold statement of fact. The life I had carefully built, the security I had so desperately sought, shattered around me. But instead of the fear I expected, something else stirred inside me. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, not of dread, but of pure, unadulterated resolve. I didn't flinch, I didn't cry. I simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. It was a silent promise to myself, a vow whispered in the depths of my own mind. This new family, this shadowy world he had dragged me into, would regret the day they thought they could control me. They would regret bringing me into their fold. David thought he had found a demure wife, someone who would simply fall in line. He had found his undoing. A subtle tremor ran through David's hand as he turned away, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. He walked slowly back towards the bedroom, leaving me alone in the moonlit living room. I watched him go, my smile widening, a dangerous glint in my eyes. The quiet life I had sought, the predictable future I had mapped out, was over. But a new, far more dangerous game had just begun, and I intended to play it to win. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My story, before David, was rooted deep in a small coastal town in Maine. It was a place where the scent of salt and pine was always in the air, a constant companion to the rhythmic sound of fishing boats heading out or coming in. Life there moved with a predictable rhythm, a comfort I had known since birth. Our community was close-knit, everyone knew everyone, and family histories stretched back generations like the roots of old oak trees. My family, like many others, had been fishermen and small business owners for as long as anyone could remember. We valued stability, hard work, and the strength of community ties above everything else. There was an unspoken expectation, a gentle pressure, to marry someone solid, someone from the town, and to settle down within its familiar, comforting embrace. It wasn't a burden, not exactly, but it was a path laid out for me, one I largely accepted. Despite the comfort of my upbringing, I harbored a quiet longing for a very specific kind of security. I wanted a partner who would offer a dependable, peaceful existence. I had seen enough emotional volatility in some of the local relationships, enough drama and heartbreak, to know I wanted something different for myself. My dream wasn't grand. It was simple. I wanted a quiet home, a steady hand to hold mine, and a predictable, unwavering love. I wasn't looking for fireworks, just a warm, consistent flame. Then David arrived in town. He was a recent transplant, a bit of an enigma, but he seemed to fit my ideal perfectly. He was a skilled fisherman, quiet and respectful, with an air of polite mystery that I found intriguing rather than alarming. He wasn't flashy or loud, just steady. He seemed to embody the stable, grounded future I craved, a stark contrast to the dramatic men I'd encountered before. He spoke little about his past, which I took as a sign of his humble nature, not a red flag. He was just a man who worked hard, kept to himself, and seemed to appreciate the simple things, like the sunrise over the water. Our courtship was gentle, almost unassuming. It wasn't filled with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with shared silences that felt comfortable and mutual respect, or at least, that's what I believed at the time. We'd spend evenings on the porch, watching the stars or walking along the shore, him telling me about the tides and the fish, me listening, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't known before. He quickly integrated into the community, earning trust with his diligent work ethic. He always showed up, always did what he said he would. People liked him. He was quiet, but dependable. He became the anchor I desperately sought, the rock I felt I could finally build my life upon. He seemed so solid, so real, so safe. I thought I had found exactly what I wanted, a quiet man who would provide a quiet life. I couldn't have been more wrong. The man I thought I married, the one who promised me a future of peace, was a carefully constructed lie. Looking back, I can see the cracks started forming almost immediately, subtle at first, like tiny hairline fractures in what I thought was solid glass. They weren't big, dramatic fights or outbursts, but rather small, unsettling inconsistencies in David's behavior that I rationalized away, eager to believe in the peaceful future he represented. He had a way of turning manipulative control into what felt like concern, a gentle guidance that slowly, almost imperceptibly, chipped away at my sense of autonomy. There were promises he'd make about our future, about things we'd do or decisions we'd make together. But then, quietly, he'd backtrack. Or he'd subtly shift the blame when those promises weren't kept, making me feel like I'd misunderstood or that my expectations were unreasonable. He'd say things like, "I only want what's best for us," and sometimes that means making hard choices that you might not quite understand yet. It was always delivered with that gentle smile, a softness in his eyes that made me question my own perception, making me wonder if I really was being too sensitive, too demanding. Then came the veiled criticisms of my background, my family's simple ways or my own aspirations. He never said anything outright mean. Instead, it was always a gentle suggestion that perhaps my small-town ideas were a bit naive for the real world, or that my dreams were charming, but not entirely practical. He'd frame it as, him trying to broaden my horizons, trying to protect me. But each comment, each subtle put-down, chipped away at my confidence, making me feel less capable, less worthy, outside of his influence. I remember instances where David subtly isolated me from friends or even family. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic cutoff. He'd suggest that we needed our special couple time, or that certain friends weren't truly understanding of our unique bond. He'd say, "They just don't get us, do they? We're different." It felt romantic at first, like we were building our own private world. But slowly, without realizing it, I became more dependent on him, my social circle shrinking to just David. He became my only confidant, my only connection to the outside world, which felt less and less like my own. Financial decisions were another area where his control manifested. Despite our shared life, decisions about our savings, investments, or even larger purchases were increasingly made without my input. When I'd ask, he'd explain it away as his better understanding of money matters, his experience in managing things. He'd patiently break down complex terms I didn't fully grasp, making me feel ignorant and grateful for his supposed expertise. It always ended with me deferring to him, believing he truly had our best interests at heart, that he was simply taking care of things for both of us. The insidious nature of his control was particularly effective within our small-town American community. Here, such behaviors could easily be dismissed as traditional masculinity, a man taking care of his family, or being the head of the household. People here valued a strong, silent type, someone who seemed capable and in charge. If I ever voiced a concern to a friend, it was often met with, "Oh, he's just being a man," or "He sounds like he really cares about you." I often questioned if I was overreacting, if my feelings were unwarranted, if I was just being difficult. I thought I was lucky to have a man who was so responsible. I realize now that the dramatic opening event, that chilling phone call, wasn't an isolated incident at all. It was the final, undeniable piece of a puzzle I hadn't dared to assemble. All those quiet moments, those subtle manipulations, the gentle smiles masking veiled criticisms, they were all part of a larger pattern. They were years of quiet erosion, slowly wearing down my defenses, preparing me for a life I never knew I was walking into. He hadn't just married me. He had carefully sculpted me, molding me into a compliant partner for a life I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The quiet fisherman wasn't just a facade. He was a master manipulator, and I, the trusting small-town girl, had been his perfect target. The emotional atmosphere in our home became heavier, suffocating me slowly. David's quiet demeanor, which I once found so comforting, now transformed into a brooding silence. This silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense, punctuated by sudden, cutting remarks that seemed to come out of nowhere. It felt like walking on eggshells, constantly anticipating the next shift in his mood. Minor disagreements, which used to be resolved with calm discussions, now escalated into tense standoffs. David had a way of using psychological tactics to assert his dominance. He would subtly twist my words until I sounded unreasonable, or he would dismiss my feelings as irrational, making me doubt my own sanity. He'd say things like, "Are you sure that's what happened?" or "Is that just how you feel?" making me question my own memory and perception. The once peaceful silences that defined our early relationship now felt oppressive. Each moment stretched thin with unspoken tension. The small-town gossip, which I had always found mildly annoying but harmless, now turned into something more sinister. Whispers started circulating about David's increasingly erratic behavior. People noticed my apparent withdrawal, how I rarely went out alone or with friends anymore. Neighbors and even some family members began to offer unsolicited advice, usually delivered with a pitying look. "Are you doing okay, dear?" they'd ask, their eyes betraying a deeper concern. Some cast judgmental glances, as if I were somehow complicit in David's changes, adding to my growing isolation. I felt like I was constantly under scrutiny, judged by a community that once felt like a warm embrace. David's family business calls became more frequent, and his absences grew longer. He would disappear for days at a time, sometimes with only a vague explanation. When he was home, he was distant, often lost in thought, his eyes glazed over. He would snap at me over trivial matters, his patience worn thin. The quiet fisherman mask he had worn so perfectly began to slip more frequently, revealing glimpses of a ruthless individual I barely recognized. I saw a coldness in his eyes, a calculating stare that sent shivers down my spine. He would talk on the phone in Korean, his voice low and urgent, using names I didn't recognize, in terms that sounded vaguely threatening, though I couldn't understand the language. I knew it wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was something darker, something dangerous. I felt the crushing weight of external judgment pressing down on me, combined with an internal dread that grew stronger each day. The secure life I had sought, the quiet home and steady hand I dreamed of, had become a cage. The man I married, the one who promised me predictability and peace, was now a stranger. His presence filled the house with an unsettling energy, a constant hum of unspoken threats. I walked through my own home feeling like an intruder, constantly on edge. My sleep was restless, filled with fragmented nightmares. I lost my appetite, and my reflection showed a woman I barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, tense, and constantly worried. This was the peak of my emotional torment. Every day felt like a battle to simply exist, to keep my head above water, before the inevitable break. I knew, deep down, that something had to give. The illusion was crumbling, and with it, my entire world. I was no longer just unhappy. I was trapped, and the walls were closing in. The constant dread became too much to bear. I couldn't live like this anymore, waiting for the next outburst, the next chilling phone call. Something inside me snapped. I knew I had to find out what was really going on, even if it meant facing a truth far worse than my fears. One afternoon, while David was out on one of his increasingly long fishing trips, I decided to act. My hands trembled as I searched his belongings, something I had never dared to do before. I started in his study, then his closet, but found nothing out of the ordinary. My gut told me to look elsewhere. I remembered David spending an unusual amount of time in his boat, even when the weather was bad. He'd always insisted on keeping it locked, saying it was for expensive equipment. That day, I found his spare keys hanging on a hook in the garage, a place he usually kept much more secure. My heart pounded as I unlocked the cabin door. The interior smelled of diesel and salt, but also something else, something metallic and unfamiliar. My eyes scanned the small space. It looked like a typical fishing boat cabin, nets neatly stowed, buoys stacked. But then I noticed a loose panel near the navigation console. It wasn't quite flush with the others. With trembling fingers, I pried it open. Inside, it wasn't fishing gear. My breath caught in my throat. There was a stack of carefully organized documents, all in Korean. Next to them lay a small, sleek burner phone, unlike any I'd seen him use. And then my gaze fell upon it. A small, ornate dagger with an intricately carved handle, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. it was clearly not a fishing knife. I pulled out the documents, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped them. Most were in a language I couldn't understand, but some pages had charts and graphs that looked like detailed financial ledgers. There were maps, too, marked with locations I recognized as major cities in Asia. Then I saw the photographs. They were pictures of men, some with stern faces, others with unsettling smiles. I recognized a few of them from international news reports I'd vaguely heard about, stories of organized crime, of powerful syndicates in Korea. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. My quiet fisherman husband wasn't just involved. He was a key player, an heir to a Korean Mafia syndicate. The world tilted. Just as the full weight of this revelation hit me, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. David was back. Panic seized me, but I forced myself to move, shoving everything back into the hidden compartment, trying to make it look undisturbed. I stumbled out of the boat just as he was getting out of his truck, his phone already pressed to his ear. He didn't see me, his face grim, his voice low and urgent. "Territory dispute," I heard him say, the English words cutting through the Korean. "Enforcement." His tone was chillingly calm, almost casual, as he spoke of violence. It solidified everything I had just discovered. My life, as I knew it, was over. The secure future I had dreamed of, the predictable peace, it was all a lie. I was married to a man who was not only a criminal, but a dangerous one, an heir to an empire built on fear and violence. My initial resolve, born from desperation, now hardened into a clear, unwavering plan. I was no longer the passive victim, trapped and suffering. This devastating revelation, this undeniable proof, had broken the cycle of my suffering. I was an active agent now, determined to expose David and dismantle his criminal empire. Even if it meant risking everything, I would fight back. My own survival, and perhaps the safety of others, depended on it. The revelation that David was heir to a Korean Mafia syndicate plunged me into a maelstrom of fear, anger, and profound betrayal. Every memory, every quiet moment we shared, now felt tainted, a cruel joke played on my naive heart. I grappled with the terrifying reality of his true identity, the immense danger I was now in. How could I have been so blind? The shame of my naivete washed over me, a bitter taste in my mouth. I had sought security, a predictable life, and instead, I had married a ghost, a man whose true self was a monster. The fear of retaliation from such a powerful criminal organization was paralyzing. I imagined their reach, their ruthlessness, and a cold dread settled deep in my bones. But beneath the fear, a fierce determination began to ignite. I had been foolish, yes, but I was not weak. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my fight. My small-town community, once a source of comfort, now became a mirror reflecting my shattered world. Initially, their reactions were a mix of shock and suspicion. Whispers followed me. Hushed conversations ceased when I entered a room. Some friends, fearing involvement, distanced themselves, their polite smiles now strained and distant. It stung, but I understood. They were protecting themselves, their families, from a danger they couldn't comprehend. Yet, amidst the withdrawal, a few unexpected allies emerged. Old Mr. Henderson, a reclusive former detective who lived down the road, started leaving his newspaper on my porch with certain articles circled. Stories about organized crime, about legal loopholes, about hidden assets. He never spoke directly about David, but his silent gestures offered a lifeline of support. And Martha, my oldest friend, a woman who rarely left her bait shop, began to offer quiet counsel, tips on how to be discreet, how to listen without being heard. She even offered to let me use her old, untraceable flip phone for emergencies. Their quiet support was a balm to my raw nerves, a reminder that not everyone was turning away. The cultural dynamics of David's hidden life added a complex layer to everything. The community struggled to reconcile their image of the quiet, hard-working fisherman with the brutal reality of his true identity. There was an undercurrent of prejudice, hushed remarks about foreigners and their ways, but also genuine concern from those who had known me for years. It was a strange mix of judgment and empathy, a small town wrestling with a global threat. The psychological toll was immense. Sleepless nights became the norm, my mind replaying every interaction, searching for clues I had missed, signs I had ignored. Constant anxiety was a shadow that followed me, a tight knot in my stomach. I felt a profound sense of isolation, even with the allies I had found. How could anyone truly understand the depth of this betrayal? Yet this very betrayal fueled a cold resolve. My fear, once paralyzing, began to transform into a strategic mindset. I knew I couldn't confront David directly, not yet. I needed to be smart, to be meticulous. My survival depended on outmaneuvering a dangerous enemy, someone who had lived a double life with chilling precision. I began to gather evidence, meticulously. I took pictures of the documents in the hidden compartment whenever David was out, careful to put everything back exactly as I found it. I started a hidden journal, detailing his absences, his phone calls, fragments of conversations I overheard. I learned to listen, truly listen, to the nuances in his voice, the subtle shifts in his demeanor. I even started to learn basic Korean phrases, enough to recognize keywords, to understand fragments of his calls. My home, once a sanctuary, was now a battlefield, and I, the quiet wife, was preparing for war. The meticulous collection of evidence, born from fear and fueled by betrayal, became my anchor. I spent weeks, then months, working in the shadows of my own home, documenting everything. Each coded ledger entry, every strange phone number, every whispered conversation I managed to decipher, was a piece of the puzzle. I wasn't just gathering proof of David's crimes. I was reclaiming my own narrative, brick by painful brick. I studied everything, from the subtle nuances of organized crime reports to the precise legal language required for a solid case. I became a quiet detective in my own life, driven by a need for justice that now burned hotter than any fear. The time came for action. I knew I couldn't go directly to the local police. David's reach was too wide, his influence too deep. Instead, I carefully packaged my findings, anonymizing them as much as possible, and sent them to a trusted local journalist known for her tenacity and integrity. I had followed her work for years, seen her fearlessly expose corruption. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was calculated. The information I provided was irrefutable, a mountain of data that painted a clear picture of an international criminal enterprise operating right under the nose of our quiet town. The story broke like a tidal wave. The journalist, armed with my evidence, published a series of articles that sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. The quiet fisherman, David, was exposed as the heir to a powerful Korean Mafia syndicate. The initial public disbelief quickly turned to outrage as more details emerged. The FBI, already alerted by the journalist, and now unable to ignore the mounting public pressure, launched a full-scale investigation. The dismantling of David's network in the United States was swift and decisive. His quiet fisherman facade crumbled publicly, replaced by the grim reality of his true identity. Federal agents swarmed the town, raiding properties, seizing assets, and making arrests. David himself was apprehended during a desperate attempt to flee the country. He faced severe legal repercussions, not just for his criminal enterprise, but also for the psychological manipulation and abuse he had inflicted. The charges were extensive, covering everything from money laundering to racketeering, and the evidence I had so painstakingly gathered proved instrumental. I testified. It was terrifying, standing in that courtroom, facing him, but my voice was strong and clear. I spoke of the quiet life I had sought, the trust I had placed in him, and the slow, insidious way he had eroded my sense of self. I detailed his deception, his control, and the constant fear I had lived under. My testimony, alongside the overwhelming evidence, ensured his accountability. He was convicted, his criminal empire shattered, and his life of double-dealing brought to a definitive end. Months later, I found myself standing on the familiar dock, watching the sunrise paint the Maine coast in hues of orange and pink. The scent of salt and pine filled the air, just as it always had. But something was different. I was different. The quiet life I once dreamed of, the one I thought David would provide, was gone. And in its place, I had found something far more profound. I was no longer seeking security in another person, in a predictable routine, or in the absence of conflict. I had found it within myself. The journey, born from betrayal and fear, had led to an unexpected strength, a resilience I never knew I possessed. I understood now that true peace didn't come from hiding from darkness, but from having the courage to confront it. The quiet life I once craved wasn't about an easy existence. It was about the inner peace that comes from standing strong, even when the world around you is in chaos. I was finally free, not just from David, but from the illusions that had once bound me.